The night was quiet over the hills of Montana until the sky split open with a scream of burning metal and blinding light that turned darkness into day for just a moment before fading back into black. Jake Morrison stood on his porch with a cup of coffee growing cold in his hand as he watched something massive tear through the clouds and slam into the earth somewhere in his north pasture with enough force to shake the wooden boards beneath his boots and rattle the windows of his farmhouse. Was 34 years old and had spent 8 years as a Marine before coming home to take over his family's cattle ranch after his father passed away 2 winters ago, and in all his years of combat deployments and strange experiences he had never seen anything like what had just fallen from the sky. Jake set down his coffee and grabbed his rifle from beside the door, along with a flashlight and his truck keys, because whatever had crashed was on his property, and the nearest neighbor was 15 miles away, and emergency services would take at least an hour to arrive, even if he called them right now. The drive across his land took 10 minutes of bouncing over rough terrain until he saw the glow ahead and the smoke rising against the stars. Like a wound in the darkness, the crater was still burning when he arrived, and at its center sat something that made him stop the truck and just stare for a long moment. It was a ship, but not any kind of ship the humans had ever built, with a hull of silver metal that seemed to shimmer even through the damage, and strange symbols running along its surface that pulsed with a faint blue light like a heartbeat, growing weaker with each pulse. Jake approached slowly with his rifle raised because he had learned in war that caution kept you alive, but nothing in his training had prepared him for what he found when he reached the cracked hull and looked inside. 3 figures lay among the wreckage, and they looked almost human, but not quite, because their skin held a soft lavender color like the sky just before dawn, and their hair seemed to glow with a light of its own, like starlight had been woven into each strand. 2 of them appeared to be teenagers, and the third was younger, maybe 10 or 11 years old by human standards, and all 3 of them were unconscious and bleeding from wounds that seeped a liquid that was violet rather than red. Jake made his decision without hesitation, because whatever these beings were, they were injured and young and alone on a strange world, and he had spent too many years watching people die in foreign deserts to stand by while 3 girls bled out in his field. No matter what color their blood was, he slung his rifle over his shoulder and climbed into the wreckage, being careful not to cut himself on the jagged metal as he made his way to the first figure, who was the eldest of the 3. She was light in his arms, lighter than a human of her size should have been, and he carried her to his truck and laid her gently in the back seat before returning for the others. The middle one stirred slightly as he lifted her and made a sound that might have been words in a language he did not understand, but she did not wake fully, and he placed her beside her sister, or at least he assumed they were sisters given how similar they looked. The youngest was the one who frightened him, because when he picked her up, her eyes opened suddenly, and he found himself looking into irises that swirled with colors he had no names for, like galaxies spinning in miniature within her gaze. She looked at him with pure terror and tried to struggle, but she was too weak, and Jake held her gently and spoke in the soft voice he used to calm frightened horses. Easy now. You are safe. I am not going to hurt you. I promise you are safe. Whether she understood his words or just his tone, he did not know, but she stopped fighting, and her strange eyes searched his face for a long moment before they closed again, and she went limp in his arms. Jake drove back to his farmhouse faster than was safe, but he could not bring himself to care about the bumps and jolts as long as he got these 3 to safety before they lost any more of that violet blood. He carried them inside one by one and laid them on his beds and his couch, and then he retrieved the extensive first aid kit he kept in his bathroom, because living alone on a remote ranch meant you learned to handle your own injuries. Their biology was strange, but not so different that he could not figure out what needed to be done, and he cleaned their wounds and bandaged them as best he could, while hoping that whatever healing abilities they possessed would do the rest. The eldest woke first, just as the sun was beginning to lighten the eastern sky, and she sat up with a gasp and raised her hands in a gesture that was clearly defensive, and Jake found himself staring at crackling energy that gathered between her fingers like lightning waiting to strike. He raised his own hand, slowly showing her that he held no weapon and kept his voice calm and steady, even though his heart was pounding. "Wait. I found you in the crash. I brought you here to help. I am not your enemy." She studied him with those impossible swirling eyes, and he could see her mind working behind him as she assessed the situation and weighed her options and tried to determine if he was telling the truth. After a long moment, she touched a small device at her throat and spoke in a language that sounded like music mixed with mathematics before pausing and trying again in words he could understand. "You saved us. I tried my best. Your ship came down in my field, and you and the others were hurt badly." She lowered her hands and the energy faded away as she looked around the simple farmhouse with its wooden furniture and faded photographs on the walls. "I am Kira. The others are my sisters Neela and young Sarah. We are grateful for your help, but we are also in great danger, and by helping us you may have put yourself in danger as well." Jake nodded slowly because he had suspected as much given the circumstances of their arrival. "Why do you not start from the beginning and tell me what kind of trouble followed you to my planet?" Kira looked at him for a long moment, and then she began to speak. And what she told him changed everything Jake Morrison thought he knew about the universe and humanity's place within it. They were princesses of something called the Celestin Dominion, which was an empire that spanned hundreds of worlds across the galaxy, and their mother was the Empress Valara, who ruled over billions of beings. A faction of rebel houses had attempted to overthrow their mother, and the princesses had been sent away for their protection. But their escort ships had been destroyed in an ambush, and their emergency jump had brought them to this system, which was not even registered in galactic databases. "Your planet is what we call primitive," Kyra explained, "untouched by galactic civilization, unknown to most species, which is why we ended up here when our navigation failed. So you were lost, very lost, with no way to contact our mother or our people." Jake absorbed this information with the calm he had developed during years of combat when panic meant death and clear thinking meant survival. "All right then," he said finally. "First things first, are you hungry? Because I do not know what alien princesses eat, but I can make a decent breakfast if you are willing to try human food." Kira stared at him as if he had said something completely unexpected. And then for the first time since she had woken up, she smiled. "I believe I would like that very much." And that was how Jake Morrison, a simple cattle rancher from Montana, became the protector of 3 lost alien princesses who had nowhere else to go and no one else to trust on a world that was strange to them in every possible way. 3 weeks passed on the Morrison ranch, and the alien princesses healed faster than any human could have managed with wounds that should have taken months to recover, closing up in days, thanks to whatever strange biology flowed through there. Lavender Veins Jake converted his barn into a workspace where Kira could examine the damaged components she had salvaged from their crashed ship, though she admitted early on that the vessel was beyond repair, and they would need to find another way to contact their people. During the days he taught them about Earth, and during the evenings they taught him about the universe, and both sides found the exchange fascinating in ways neither had expected. Neela was the middle sister, and she had a sharp mind that devoured information, like a starving person devoured food, and she spent hours reading through Jake's collection of books, asking questions about human history and culture and science that made him realize how little he actually knew about his own species. This author thinks space travel involves sitting in metal boxes and waiting for years to reach other stars, Mila said one afternoon while reading an old science fiction novel she had found on his shelf. "Does he not know about full drives?" "We have not invented those yet," Jake replied. "How do you not have full drives?" You have nuclear fission and basic computing. Full drive should come naturally after that. We are working on it. Sarah was the youngest, and she was pure joy, despite everything her family had been through, with a childish wonder at Earth's simple pleasures that made Jake smile even on his hardest. Day she fell in love with his dog, a big friendly mutt named Cooper, who had never met a stranger. He did not want a lick, and she spent hours throwing sticks for him in the yard and laughing when he brought them back covered in slobber. We do not have animals like this on our homeworld, she told Jake one evening as Cooper lay with his head in her lap. Our pets are more like what you would call insects, but very intelligent, and they do not show affection like this. Dogs are special. Jake agreed. They love you no matter what. Kyra was the eldest, and she carried the weight of responsibility on her shoulders, like a physical burden that pressed down on her every moment of every day. She was formal and serious and rarely smiled, but Jake caught glimpses of the person beneath the prince's mask when she thought no one was watching, and he saw how much she worried about her sisters and her mother and the fate of her empire. One evening she found him on the porch watching the sunset, and she sat down beside him without speaking. For a long time, "Why do you help us?" she asked finally. "You owe us nothing, and by harboring us you put yourself at great risk, because those who hunt us will not care that you are innocent." Jake considered the question carefully before answering. "Where I come from, we have a saying. You do not leave people behind. I found you hurt and scared and alone, and I could help, so I did, because that is what decent people do." Decent people. Kyra repeated the words as if tasting them. Our culture values honor and duty and the obligations of blood, but simple decency is not something we often speak of. Maybe you should. She looked at him with those swirling eyes, and something passed between them that neither of them could have named. "Tell me about your world," she said. "Not the facts, but what it feels like to live here." So, Jake told her about growing up on the ranch and learning to ride horses before he could read and the way the seasons changed the land from green to gold to white and back again. Told her about joining the Marines because he wanted to see the world and serve his country, and the things he had seen in war that still visited him in dreams. Sometimes he told her about coming home to find his father sick and staying to help, until the old man passed and deciding to keep the ranch going because it was the only home he had ever known. "You have suffered," Kyra said when he finished. "Lost people you loved and seen terrible things, yet you remain kind. How?" "I do not know if I am kind," Jake admitted. "But I try to be, because the alternative is letting the darkness win, and I'm too stubborn for that." Kyra smiled, then a real smile that transformed her face from something coldly beautiful into something warm and alive. "Stubbornness," she said, "is apparently a human trait my tutors failed to mention when they taught me about primitive species. We prefer to call it determination." As the days turned into weeks, Jake found himself growing attached to his unexpected guests in ways he had not anticipated. He taught them to ride horses, and Kyra took to it immediately, finding parallels to the ceremonial mounts of her homeworld, while Nyla complained about the smell, and Sarah tried to convince Cooper to let her ride him instead. He taught them to fish in the stream behind his property and cook simple meals over a campfire and identify the constellations that looked so different from what they were used to seeing in their own skies. In return, they told him about the wonders of the galaxy, the great ring stations that orbited dead stars, and the living ships that swam through the void between worlds, and the ancient ruins of civilizations that had risen and fallen before Earth's sun had even formed. "Your species is very young," Mila explained one night as they sat around the fire. "By galactic standards, you have only just learned to walk. Most species take millions of years to reach the stars, and you have only had organized society for a few thousand. Is that bad?" "It is unusual, especially for a Death World species." Jake raised an eyebrow at the term. "Your planet is classified as a Death World," Kira explained. extreme temperature variations, abundant predators, parasites, and diseases, natural disasters, a star that causes cellular damage, atmospheric toxins, and you have no natural armor or venom or regeneration by all statistical models. Humans should not exist. Yet here we are. Yet here you are. Kira agreed. And that is what makes your species so fascinating and so terrifying to those who study such things. Sierra looked up from where she was roasting a marshmallow that Jake had introduced her to earlier that week. I like humans, she declared. You are warm and you make sweet food and you have dogs. I think when I am Empress, someday I will make Earth a protected world. You want to be Empress. Mother says I have the temperament for it. Sierra grinned. Kira is too serious and Neela is too curious, but I am just right. She is also too young to understand what being Empress actually means. Kara said dryly, I'm 11. Exactly. Jake laughed at their bickering because it reminded him of siblings everywhere, human or alien, and he felt something loosen in his chest that had been tight for a very long time. He had been alone on this ranch for 2 years since his father died, and he had not realized how much he missed having people around until 3 alien princesses crashed into his life and made him remember what it felt like to have a family. He did not know then that their time of peace was running out, or that hunters were already closing in on their position, drawn by the energy signature of their crashed ship. Did not know that he would soon have to fight for their lives with nothing but human weapons and human stubbornness, against enemies who considered his entire species to be primitive and weak. But when that moment came, Jake Morrison would show the galaxy exactly what a Death World species was capable of when it had something worth protecting. 3 days after the battle with the Syndicate hunters, the sky over Montana darkened in a way that had nothing to do with clouds. Jake was repairing the damage to his barn when he noticed a shadow falling across his property, and he looked up to see something descending through the atmosphere that made his breath catch in his throat. It was a ship, but calling it that felt wrong in the same way that calling the ocean a pond would feel wrong, because this vessel was easily a mile long, with a hull that gleamed with gold and silver patterns and weapons that bristled from every surface. That would be Mother, Kira said from beside him with a voice that was carefully controlled. I figured as much. The warship settled into orbit high above the Earth, and a smaller craft detached from its belly, a shuttle that was still larger than anything humans had ever built, that looked tiny compared to the massive vessel it came from. It landed in the same field where Jake had killed 6 hunters 3 days before, its sleek form making even those advanced vessels look crude by comparison. A ramp extended, and figures began to emerge. A dozen guards in armor that seemed to flow like liquid metal, and then behind them a woman, who could only be the Empress herself. Alara was everything her daughters had described, and more. She stood nearly 7 feet tall with the same lavender skin as her children, but hers seemed to glow with an inner light that spoke of power beyond anything Jake had ever encountered. Her hair was starlight, woven into an elaborate style that incorporated floating gems that orbited her head like tiny moons, and her gown flowed like mercury, catching every beam of sunlight and scattering it into rainbows. But it was her presence that struck Jake the hardest, an authority that radiated from her like heat from a fire, the kind of power that came from ruling billions of beings across hundreds of worlds. Her guards fanned out as she approached the farmhouse where Jake and the princesses waited, their weapons humming with barely contained energy. Mother, Kyra said, stepping forward with a formal bow that her sisters echoed. Valar's expression was unreadable as she studied her daughters, taking in every detail of their appearance and their health and the strange human clothing they wore. Then, without warning, she pulled all 3 of them into an embrace that shattered any illusion of imperial dignity. She held them for a long moment, and Jake caught the glisten of tears on her alien features as she pressed her face against their hair and whispered words in a language he could not understand, My children, she said finally in a voice thick with emotion. I feared the worst when your escort was destroyed, when we could not find any trace of you. I thought. She stopped herself and composed her expression with visible effort, the Empress mask sliding back into place over the worried mother. You will tell me everything that happened. Her gaze shifted to Jake, and he felt the weight of it like a physical force pressing against his chest. This was a woman who commanded fleets that could destroy planets, who ruled an empire older than human civilization, who held the power of life and death over more beings than Jake could comprehend. He was standing before her in dirty jeans and a flannel shirt with his rifle slung over his shoulder. You are the human who protected my daughters. Yes, ma'am. She approached him slowly, and her guards tensed as if expecting him to attack, though Jake could not imagine what he could possibly do. Against beings with that kind of technology up close, she was even more intimidating. Her alien beauty so perfect, it was almost painful to look at, and her eyes swirling with colors that made the princess's eyes look simple by comparison. My daughters tell me you sheltered them for nearly 2 months, that you fought off syndicate hunters alone to protect them, that you asked nothing in return for your service. That is about the size of it. Why? Jake met her swirling eyes without flinching because he had faced death too many times to be intimidated by power, even power on this scale, because they needed help and I could give it. Where I come from, that is reason enough. Valara studied him for a long moment, as if searching for some hidden motive or deception. Tell me again what happened when the hunters attacked. She said, turning to Kyra, the eldest princess, recounted the battle in detail, describing how Jake had positioned them in safety and then faced 8 armed hunters alone with nothing but what she called primitive kinetic weapons. Nyla added technical observations about the limitations of the hunter shields against sustained projectile fire, and Sarah described how Jake had promised to come back and how he had kept that promise as they spoke. Jake watched the Empress's expression shift from skepticism to disbelief to something that looked almost like fear. You killed 6 syndicate hunters with kinetic weapons, she said when they finished, alone on foot with no augmentation or advanced technology. They were not as tough as they thought they were. Those hunters were augmented soldiers with centuries of combat experience and personal shields that should have made them invincible against a species at your technological level. Should have. Jake repeated. That word keeps coming up. Something changed in Valara's expression then. A reassessment of everything she thought she knew about this primitive world and its dangerous inhabitants. The galactic community does not know about Earth, she said slowly. Your system is not registered in any database. To most species, this world does not exist. We prefer it that way. I suspect you do. She was quiet for a moment, studying him with an intensity that made Jake feel like she was reading his entire history from his face. Jake Morrison, she said finally, you have done my house a service that cannot be easily repaid. The lives of my daughters are beyond price. Name your reward, and if it is within my power to grant it, is yours. Jake considered this carefully because an Empress of an interstellar civilization was offering him anything he wanted. Wealth beyond imagination, technology that could change the world, knowledge of the stars, power that most humans could not even dream of. I want you to leave Earth alone, he said. Valara's eyebrows rose in surprise. No contact with humanity until we are ready. No interference in our development. Let us find our own way to the stars. That is all you ask. You could have anything in the known galaxy, and you choose isolation. We have enough problems without adding galactic politics to the mix. Jake replied. Besides, your daughters told me we are a Death World species. Maybe you should give us time to grow up before you introduce us to the neighborhood. Valara looked at him for a long moment, and then she did something Jake had not expected. She laughed. A wise sentiment from a wise man. She said, Very well, Jake Morrison, it will be done. Earth will remain unregistered and protected by imperial decree until your species chooses otherwise. No one will interfere with your development, and any who try will answer to the full might of the Celestin Dominion." She extended her hand in a gesture that was clearly borrowed from human custom, and Jake shook it. "Thank you, Your Majesty." "No, Jake Morrison, thank you for protecting what is most precious to me when I could not do so myself." She turned to her daughters. "Come. It is time to return home. Your people have mourned long enough, and there is much work to be done to restore stability to the Empire." The princesses each came to say goodbye to Jake. Kira thanked him formally for his hospitality and protection, and promised that the Dominion would remember his service. Neela pressed a small device into his hand and told him it contained an educational database that would allow him to learn about the galaxy at his own pace. Sarah was the hardest. She wrapped her arms around him and cried into his chest for a long time before her mother gently pulled her away. "You will not forget us?" she asked with tears streaming down her lavender cheeks. "Never," Jake promised. "Not ever." He watched them board the shuttle and watched it rise into the sky and watched the great warship dwindle to a point of light before vanishing entirely into whatever dimension allowed faster than light travel. Then he stood alone in his field, surrounded by the evidence of everything that had happened, and looked up at the stars with new understanding. The universe was vast and strange and full of wonders and dangers beyond human imagination, but Earth was protected now, given time to grow and develop and find its own path to the stars. And somewhere out there, 3 alien princesses would remember the human who had saved them, with nothing but stubbornness and kindness and the refusal to leave anyone behind. Jake Morrison went back to his house and poured himself a drink and sat on his porch watching the sunset. His life would never be the same, but that was all right. Some things were worth changing for. The morning started like any other with Jake mending a fence in the east pasture while the sun climbed slowly over the mountains and painted the grass with gold. But everything changed when Kira's voice crackled over the radio he had given her. "Jake, you need to come back now. Our sensors have detected ships entering the atmosphere, multiple vessels in attack formation. They are not Dominion." He was in his truck and racing back toward the house before she finished speaking because he had heard the fear in her voice, and Kira was not someone who frightened easily. "How many?" he asked. 8 small craft. Jake, these are syndicate hunters. They tracked the energy signature from our crash. They have found us. The syndicate was something the princesses had mentioned before. A criminal organization that had allied with the rebel houses trying to overthrow their mother. They specialized in kidnapping and ransom, and they had been searching for the missing princesses since the ambush that brought them to Earth. Jake pushed the truck as fast as it would go over the rough terrain and burst through his front door to find all 3 sisters waiting in the living room with expressions that mixed fear and determination in equal measure. Kira had retrieved a small energy weapon from the salvaged wreckage of their ship, but he could see the way her hands trembled as she held it. "Is there anywhere we can run?" Neela asked. Jake looked at the 3 of them, at Kira trying to be brave for her sisters and Neela trying to calculate their odds, and little Sarah clutching Cooper like he was the only solid thing in a world that had suddenly become terrifying. "This is my home," he said flatly. "I am not running from it." He moved to the gun safe in his bedroom and began pulling out weapons with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this many times before. His rifle was a hunting model chambered for large game with a scope that could reach out to 800 yards. His shotgun was loaded with slugs that could stop a charging bear, and his pistols were the same ones he had carried in combat. "Those are kinetic weapons," Kira said doubtfully. "The hunters will have personal shields designed to stop energy attacks. Then I will shoot them until their shields fail." "Jake, you do not understand. These are trained killers with centuries of experience and technology that makes them nearly invincible. You cannot fight them with primitive weapons. Jake checked his rifle's action and loaded a magazine with movements so smooth they were almost unconscious. Your sister called Earth a death world. She said that by all statistical models humans should not exist. Well, here is something your models did not account for. He looked at Kira with eyes that had seen war and death and loss and had kept fighting anyway. We did not survive on this world by being careful. We survived by being stubborn and mean and too angry to die. So when those hunters land, I'm going to show them what a primitive species looks like when it fights back. He positioned the princesses in the basement behind a reinforced door that Kyra had managed to create from materials salvaged from their ship and made them promise to stay hidden no matter what they heard. If I do not come back, he started to say, you will come back. Syrah interrupted with fierce certainty. You promised you would not leave us, and you do not break promises. Jake smiled despite everything and ruffled her starlight hair. You are right. I will be back soon. The hunters landed in his north field. 8 of them in sleek armor that shimmered with energy shields, carrying weapons that glowed. With barely contained power, they were humanoid, but clearly not human, with features that seemed stretched in the wrong directions and movements that were too fluid to be natural. Their leader activated some kind of translation device, and his voice boomed across the property. Human, we know you harbor the fugitives. Surrender them, and we will let you live. Resist, and we will burn your world to ash. Jake responded by putting a round through the hunter's knee. The alien went down screaming as his shield flickered and died under the impact of a high-powered rifle round that moved faster than his defensive systems could react. The other hunters scattered and returned fire with weapons that carved glowing holes through his barn wall, but Jake was already moving, dropping from his position and relocating before they could track him. What followed was not a fair fight, because fair fights were for people who had never actually been in combat. Jake used every advantage his land gave him. The terrain he had known since childhood, the shadows and cover he could navigate with his eyes closed, the knowledge of where to shoot from and where to hide. The hunters had technology that should have made them invincible against a primitive species. But their technology was designed for energy weapons, not for metal projectiles traveling at supersonic speeds. Their shields would stop a plasma bolt, but they had to work harder to stop kinetic rounds. And Jake did not give them time to recover between impacts. He fired and moved and fired again, never staying in one place long enough for them to get a fix on his position, appearing from angles they did not expect and disappearing before they could respond. 2 more hunters fell before they even understood what was happening, their shields overwhelmed by sustained fire that chipped away at their defenses until they cracked. The remaining 5 tried to regroup and advance on his position using covering fire, but Jake had spent years training for exactly this kind of combat, and he knew how to break an enemy's advance. He let them get close and then hit them from the side with his shotgun, the heavy slugs punching through weakened shields at close range and dropping 2 more before they could react. The last 3 panicked then, their confidence shattered by the realization that this primitive human was actually killing them. And they made the mistake that every enemy made when fear took over. They ran. Jake did not let them reach their ships when it was over. He stood in the center of the carnage, breathing hard with blood that was not his own staining his clothes, and the smell of gunpowder and something alien mixing. In the air, 6 hunters lay dead in his fields, and the remaining 2 were retreating into orbit, broadcasting warnings about the primitive world with the unexpectedly dangerous inhabitants. Jake waited until their ships were gone before he returned to the house and opened the basement door. The 3 princesses stared at him with expressions that he could not read. Something between disbelief and awe and fear and gratitude all mixed together. "What?" he asked. "You killed 6 syndicate hunters," Kira said slowly. "Alone, with primitive weapons. It should not be possible. They came to my home. They threatened people under my protection. I handled it." "Handled it," Mala repeated. "Jake, do you have any idea what you just did? Those hunters had centuries of combat experience and augmented bodies and technology that should have made them invincible against your species. Should have is not the same as did." Sierra crossed the room and wrapped her arms around his waist, pressing her face against his chest. "You really meant it," she said. "You really do not leave people behind." Jake put his hand on her head and held her gently. "Never," he promised. "Not while I am still breathing." Kira watched them with an expression that had shifted from shock to something like wonder. "The galactic community does not know about Earth," she said quietly. "Most species consider your world too primitive to bother with. But if they knew what you just did, if they knew what humans are capable of, then maybe it is better they do not know," Jake replied. "At least not yet." He looked out the window at the bodies in his field and the damage to his barn and the evidence of a battle that should have been impossible. "Your mother is going to have questions when she gets here." Kyra nodded slowly. "Yes, she is. And I am not sure how to explain that a single human with primitive weapons did what an entire Dominion security detail could not." "Just tell her the truth," Jake said. "Tell her that Earth is a death world, and we do not know how to quit." 3 days later, the sky would darken with the arrival of something far larger than hunting. Vessels and Jake Morrison would come face to face with the Empress of an interstellar civilization who wanted to know exactly what kind of man had protected her daughters, but that is a story for another time. 5 years passed on the Morrison ranch. Jake tended his cattle and mended his fences and watched the stars each night with an understanding that no other human on Earth possessed. The device Nyla had given him contained more information than every library on the planet combined, and he spent his evenings studying the history of galactic civilizations and the science behind technologies that humanity would not develop for centuries. He learned about the Celestine Dominion and the rebel houses that had tried to overthrow Empress Valara, and the war that had followed when she returned with her daughters and the full might of her loyal forces. He learned about other species in the galaxy, some friendly and some hostile and some so strange that even communication was impossible. He learned about Earth's classification as a death world and why the galactic community considered humans to be both primitive and terrifying in equal measure, but he told no one about any of it. The crash site had been cleaned by Imperial drones before Valara departed, and the hunter bodies had been removed, and there was no evidence that anything unusual had ever happened on his property. His neighbors assumed he had simply become more reclusive after years of living alone, and they left him to his solitude sometimes. At night he would look up at the stars and wonder what the princesses were doing, whether they were safe, whether they ever thought about the strange human who had protected them for 2 months on a primitive world at the edge of explored space. He missed them more than he had expected to. The 5th anniversary of their departure. Jake was sitting on his porch with Cooper sleeping at his feet when the familiar shriek of atmospheric entry split the quiet night. He watched a craft descend through the clouds. Smaller than the Royal Shuttle, but still unmistakably alien, with smooth lines and a hull that seemed to drink in the starlight. It landed in the same field where so much had happened, and a single figure emerged. Jake stood slowly and walked across his property to meet her. She was taller than he remembered, her features more mature, her bearing more confident, but he recognized her instantly. Even in the darkness, Sarah walked across the grass with the grace of someone who had spent years training for moments exactly like this. "Hello, Jake." "Hello, Sarah." "You have grown up." 5 years is a long time, even for our species. She stopped a few feet away from him, and her swirling eyes reflected the starlight as she studied his face. I have thought about you every day since we left. About what you did for us. About what you taught me. I did not teach you anything. Just showed you some horses and fishing and marshmallows. Sira smiled at the memory. You taught me that courage is not the absence of fear. That protecting others is its own reward. That some beings will stand against impossible odds simply because it is the right thing to do. She stepped closer. You taught me what honor looks like when it is not bound by politics or obligation. Honor that comes from the heart, rather than duty. Jake found himself smiling despite the strangeness of the situation. Your mother would probably have opinions about me teaching an imperial princess about honor. My mother sent me. That surprised him. She has watched your planet for the past 5 years. Sira continued. Studied your history and your conflicts and your art and science and dreams. She has a proposal for you. I am listening. Sira reached into her robes and withdrew a small medallion that glowed with soft golden light. Humanity is not ready for full galactic contact. On this we all agree. But the universe is dangerous, and your world is not as hidden as you might think. Eventually, others will find you, and when they do, you will need allies. She held the medallion out to him. My mother offers you a position as Earth's unofficial ambassador to the Celestin Dominion. You would remain here and live your life as you choose, but if humanity ever needed a voice in the galactic community, you would be that voice. And if threats arose that humanity could not face alone, the Dominion would answer your call. Jake took the medallion carefully. It was warm to the touch, and he could feel power humming within it like a heartbeat. That is a lot of responsibility for a cattle rancher. You are not just a cattle rancher, Sira said, and her voice carried an intensity that made him pay attention. You are the man who protected 3 alien princesses with nothing but human stubbornness and primitive weapons. You are the man who faced an Empress and asked for nothing but your world's freedom. You are the best of what humanity can be, Jake. Morrison, and that is why my mother chose you. And what do you think about all this? Sira met his eyes directly, and he saw something in her gaze that had not been there 5 years ago. Something deeper and more complex than the childish affection of an 11-year-old girl. I think I have been waiting 5 years to see you again. I think I have grown into a woman who knows what she wants, and I think I would like to stay here. For a while, if you will have me. Jake looked at the medallion in his hand, and then at the stars wheeling overhead, and then at the alien princess standing before him with hope and uncertainty warring in her expression. The guest room is still available, he said finally, but you are helping with the horses this time. Sira laughed, and the sound was like music. I have missed this world. I have missed its strange animals and primitive technology and deadly environment. She closed the distance between them and took his hand. But mostly I have missed you. They walked together toward the farmhouse with Cooper trotting alongside them and behind them. Sira's craft powered down and went dark above them. The stars continued their eternal dance. Billions of worlds spinning through the void. Civilizations rising and falling. Empires warring and making peace. And on one small planet at the edge of explored space, a human cattle rancher and an alien princess sat on a porch and watched the sunset together. Jake did not know what the future would hold. Maybe humanity would reach the stars in his lifetime, or maybe it would take centuries longer. Maybe they would join the galactic community as equals, or maybe they would carve out their own path through the universe. But whatever happened, Earth would not face it alone, because somewhere in the vastness of space, an Empress remembered the man who had protected her daughters. And a dominion spanning hundreds of worlds stood ready to answer his call somewhere on a ranch in Montana. 2 beings from different worlds. We're learning that some connections transcend species and distance and time. Sira leaned her head against Jake's shoulder as the last light faded from the sky. Tell me about the constellations again. Jake smiled and pointed up at the familiar patterns. That one there is called Orion, the hunter, and those 3 stars in a row are his belt. It does not look like a hunter. Use your imagination." She laughed again, and he felt something settle in his chest that had been restless for 5 long years. The universe was vast and strange, and full of wonders he was only beginning to understand. But right now, in this moment, he was exactly where he was supposed to be. The story was far from over, but this chapter, at least, had found its proper ending. A human who refused to leave anyone behind, and an alien princess who had come back for him. Some things were worth waiting for, and some people were worth crossing the stars to find. Jake Morrison looked up at the sky full of possibilities and smiled. The future was out there waiting for them, and when it came, they would face it together. He protected 3 lost alien princesses. Then their Empress mother came looking for him. Part 5. The return. 5 years passed on the Morrison ranch. Jake tended his cattle and mended his fences, and watched the stars each night with an understanding that no other human on Earth possessed. The device Neela had given him contained more information than every library on the planet combined, and he spent his evenings studying the history of galactic civilizations and the science behind technologies that humanity would not develop for centuries. He learned about the Celestin Dominion and the rebel houses that had tried to overthrow Empress Valara, and the war that had followed when she returned with her daughters and the full might of her loyal forces. He learned about other species in the galaxy, some friendly and some hostile, and some so strange that even communication was impossible. He learned about Earth's classification as a death world, and why the galactic community considered humans to be both primitive and terrifying in equal measure, but he told no one about any of it. The crash site had been cleaned by Imperial drones before Valara departed, and the hunter bodies had been removed, and there was no evidence that anything unusual had ever happened on his property. His neighbors assumed he had simply become more reclusive after years of living alone, and they left him to his solitude. Sometimes at night he would look up at the stars and wonder what the princesses were doing, whether they were safe, whether they ever thought about the strange human who had protected them for 2 months on a primitive world at the edge of explored space. He missed them more than he had expected to. The 5th anniversary of their departure. Jake was sitting on his porch with Cooper sleeping at his feet when the familiar shriek of atmospheric entry split the quiet night. He watched a craft descend through the clouds, smaller than the Royal Shuttle, but still unmistakably alien, with smooth lines and a hull that seemed to drink in the starlight. It landed in the same field where so much had happened, and a single figure emerged. Jake stood slowly and walked across his property to meet her as she